Bullies, push old man in market, he flattened them like trash. Thaddeus Brennan arranged the last of the morning's fresh vegetables in neat rows across his wooden stall, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work for longer than most people had been alive. At 72, with silver hair that had long since abandoned any pretense of thickness and a frame that had shrunk from 6 feet to something closer to 5'10", he looked like exactly what the Saturday morning crowd at Riverside Community Market expected. A harmless old man trying to supplement his social security by selling produce grown in the small garden behind his modest house on Elm Street. His voice, when he called out prices to potential customers, carried the gentle rasp of someone who'd spent decades breathing in everything from factory smoke to garden dust. His movements were careful, deliberate, the result of arthritis in his joints and the general caution that came with bones that took longer to heal than they used to. To the hundreds of shoppers who wandered through Riverside Market every weekend, Thaddeus Brennan was invisible in the way that elderly people often become, present but not particularly noteworthy, useful but not impressive. The market sprawled across 3 blocks that had once housed thriving shops before big box stores drained the commercial life. Now, weekends brought dozens of vendors selling organic vegetables to handmade crafts to breakfast burritos that filled the air with bacon and pepper scents. Thad had claimed the same corner spot for 8 years, since Ford plant retirement left him with too much time and too little money. His stall sat across from Rossetti's Fresh Pasta, where Angela Rossetti sold homemade noodles and sauces that drew weekend lines. Angela was 60-something, a widow who'd turned her husband's recipes into a business that barely broke even but provided purpose. What made Thad's weekends bearable was watching Angela work. She moved with grace and confidence, chatting easily with customers in accented English, never seeming to notice when people grew impatient with her pronunciation. Her determination to build something positive from loss had earned his quiet admiration, and they'd developed friendship through shared glances and brief conversations between customers. "Morning, Thad," Angela called from across the narrow aisle between their stalls. "How are the tomatoes today?" "Best of the season," he replied, his voice carrying the warmth that came naturally when he spoke to her. "Picked them yesterday evening when the light was just right." She smiled, the kind of expression that made the early morning setup and the ache in his joints seem worthwhile. "Save me some of the good ones, will you? I'm making sauce tonight for the church dinner." Their conversation was interrupted by loud laughter from the entrance, where 3 young men had gathered. The leader was Cody Patterson, thick-set with aggressive confidence from never being seriously challenged. His companions, Blake Morrison and Tyler Nash, existed to laugh at his jokes and validate his opinions. They'd been showing up for a month, arriving when crowds were thickest, claiming to support local business, but actually seeking entertainment at others' expense. "Hey, old-timer!" Cody's voice cut across the market chatter like a rusty saw. "Yeah, you with the vegetables. Your prices are highway robbery, man. $5 for a bag of tomatoes? What do you think this is, Whole Foods?" Thad looked up from arranging his display, meeting Cody's eyes with the kind of steady calm that had served him well through decades of dealing with difficult people in various contexts. "Quality costs a little more," he said evenly. "These are heirloom varieties, grown without pesticides." "Heirloom varieties," Blake repeated in a mocking tone. "Listen to Grandpa trying to sound fancy. Probably just regular tomatoes with a markup for suckers." Tyler joined in the laughter. "Bet he doesn't even grow them himself. Probably buys them at the grocery store and marks them up for idiots who think organic means something." The accusation stung because it was completely unfair. Thad spent 6 days a week tending his garden, had built his reputation over 8 years of consistent quality and honest dealing. But he'd learned long ago that arguing with people who'd already made up their minds was like trying to convince rain not to fall. "Everyone's entitled to their opinion," he said quietly, turning back to his vegetables. What they didn't know was that Thaddeus Brennan had worked 38 years at Ford River Rouge while training evenings at Mickey's boxing gym. For 25 years, he'd been a serious amateur boxer, competing in Golden Gloves tournaments and sparring with professionals. More importantly, mild-mannered Thaddeus had been Iron Thad Brennan, Michigan Golden Gloves champion in 3 weight classes, with 47 wins and only 3 losses. His gnarled hands had once been registered weapons capable of dropping men half his age. But that was before Margaret died, 5 years ago, before he'd promised her never to hurt another human being. She'd hated his boxing, worried he'd take a brain-scrambling punch or throw one that damaged someone permanently. The harassment began small, but grew pointed over following weeks. Cody and his crew arrived late mornings when the market was busiest, making loud comments about price gouging and ripping off hard-working Americans near Thad's stall. They'd handle produce roughly, squeezing tomatoes until bruised, then complain about quality while customers wondered if they should shop elsewhere. They joked about his age, his appearance, his careful speech, from an era when respect meant something. They'd bump his table, sending vegetables rolling. They'd distract him during transactions, then claim he'd shortchanged them. They'd discuss how old people needed to stop cluttering up spaces younger vendors could use better. Each incident chipped away at dignity while maintaining plausible deniability. Vendors noticed but said nothing, afraid intervention would make them targets. Angela watched it all with growing concern. During quiet moments between customers, she'd cross the narrow aisle to check on him, her dark eyes flashing with protective anger that reminded him of Margaret during her fiercer moments. "You shouldn't let them treat you that way," she said one particularly difficult Saturday morning after Cody had deliberately knocked over a display of peppers. "My Vincent, God rest his soul, he would have knocked their teeth out by now." Thad shook his head, kneeling to collect the scattered vegetables. "Violence doesn't solve anything, Angela. I learned that lesson a long time ago. Besides, they're just kids acting out. They'll get bored and find someone else to bother." "They're not kids," Angela replied firmly. "They're bullies, and bullies only understand one language." But Thad continued to turn the other cheek, continued to clean up their messes and ignore their insults. Continued to honor the promise he'd made to Margaret about leaving violence in the past where it belonged. Even when his arthritic hands shook with suppressed rage, even when he lay awake at night imagining all the ways he could end their harassment permanently, he held onto the belief that good people found better solutions than violence. The escalation reached a breaking point on a humid Saturday in late August when the market was packed with families doing their weekly shopping and tourists exploring the local flavor of Riverside's modest renaissance. Thad's stall was busier than usual, with customers drawn to his late-season tomatoes and the sweet corn that had ripened to perfection in his carefully tended rows. He was helping Mrs. Patterson, no relation to Cody thankfully, select melons when he heard Angela's voice rise in distress across the aisle. "Please, just let me work," she was saying, her accented English tight with frustration and growing fear. Thad looked up to see Cody and his crew surrounding Angela's pasta stall, Blake holding a container of her homemade marinara sauce like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "This stuff looks like it's been sitting out all day," Blake announced loudly enough for half the market to hear, "probably loaded with bacteria. You could kill someone selling food this sketchy." "That sauce was made fresh this morning," Angela protested, reaching for the container. "I followed all health department guidelines." Tyler grabbed another container, pretending to examine it closely. "I don't know, man. Smells kind of funky to me. Maybe we should report this to the health inspector, save some innocent family from food poisoning." Cody was enjoying the show, standing back with his arms crossed while his friends terrorized a woman who'd never done anything but work hard and treat people with kindness. "Yeah, this is exactly the kind of unsafe food handling that gives farmers' markets a bad name. Maybe you should stick to selling stuff that doesn't require actual cooking skills." Angela's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, but she was outnumbered and surrounded. Other vendors and customers were watching, but doing nothing, following the same unspoken rule that had protected them when Thad was being harassed. Mind your own business and hope the trouble passes you by. That's when Blake accidentally knocked over Angela's entire display of pasta containers, sending dozens of packages scattering across the asphalt while homemade sauce splattered across her white apron and the front of her stall. "Oops," Blake said with exaggerated innocence. "Guess I'm clumsier than I thought." Angela stared at the destruction of her morning's work, at the sauce staining everything, and the pasta packages that would have to be thrown away because they'd touched the ground. Thad could see tears forming in her eyes, and something inside his chest cracked like old ice under pressure. But it was what Cody said next that shattered his restraint completely. "Maybe this is a sign, Grandma," Cody said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet market. "Maybe it's time for you to retire. Let younger people with actual business sense take over this spot. Stop embarrassing yourself trying to compete with real vendors." The casual cruelty of it, the deliberate humiliation of a woman who'd worked twice as hard as any of them would ever work in their entire lives, flipped a switch in Thaddeus Brennan that had been dormant for 5 years, but never broken. He stood up slowly from behind his vegetable display, his movements different somehow, more purposeful. The careful shuffle that had marked his steps for years was replaced by something that suggested coiled power. And when he walked around his stall toward Angela's, his posture had straightened in a way that made him seem taller, more substantial. "Cody," he said quietly, his voice carrying farther than it should have given its volume. The 3 young men turned toward him with expressions of amused surprise. They'd grown so accustomed to his passive acceptance of their behavior that his direct approach caught them completely off guard. "What do you want, old man?" Cody asked, though there was something in Thad's bearing now that made his usual arrogance sound forced. "I want you to apologize to Angela," Thad said simply. "Then I want you to pay for the food you destroyed. Then I want you to leave and not come back." Blake burst out laughing. "Or what? You gonna beat us up with your walking stick? Call the cops on us for accidentally bumping into some pasta?" "I don't have a walking stick," Thad replied, and for the first time in years, his voice carried the authority that had once commanded respect in boxing rings across Michigan. "And there was nothing accidental about what you just did." Tyler stepped closer, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate the older man. "Listen, Grandpa, I think maybe you should mind your own business and go back to selling your overpriced vegetables before someone gets hurt." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and the market had grown quiet around them as vendors and customers sensed that something significant was about to happen. Angela stood behind her ruined stall, her hands clasped together, watching with an expression that mixed hope and terror. "Someone's definitely going to get hurt," Thad agreed calmly. "The question is who?" What happened next lasted maybe 30 seconds, but to everyone watching, it played out like slow-motion footage of a natural disaster. Cody threw the first punch, a looping right hand that carried all his weight and overconfidence. Thad stepped inside the arc of the swing with footwork that belonged in textbooks, his left hand snapping up to block, while his right delivered a short, sharp uppercut to Cody's solar plexus. The younger man doubled over, gasping, as all the air exploded from his lungs. Blake came at him from the side, swinging wildly. Thad caught the punch on his forearm, stepped into Blake's guard, and drove a perfectly timed hook into his liver. Blake's knees buckled immediately, the kind of body shot that shut down everything below the waist, and he collapsed onto the scattered pasta packages, groaning and clutching his side. Tyler tried to tackle him, probably thinking he could use his size and youth to overwhelm the older man through brute force. Thad sidestepped the charge like a matador avoiding a bull, grabbed Tyler's outstretched arm, and used his momentum to send him face first into the metal support post of Angela's stall. The impact rang out like a bell, and Tyler slumped to the ground with blood streaming from his broken nose. The entire confrontation had taken less than half a minute. Three men who'd swagger into the market full of arrogance and aggression were now lying on the asphalt, groaning and struggling to understand what had just happened to them. Thad stood over them, breathing normally, his white hair barely mussed from the encounter. Around him, the market had fallen completely silent, except for the distant sound of traffic on Michigan Avenue and the labored breathing of the three defeated bullies. Cody was trying to sit up, his face pale with shock and pain. How did you, he wheezed. 47 wins, 3 losses, Thad said conversationally. Michigan Golden Gloves champion 3 years running. They called me Iron Thad back when your fathers were learning to walk. He knelt down beside Cody, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough away to seem non-threatening despite what had just occurred. The younger man flinched anyway, probably expecting another demonstration of those surprisingly fast hands. You want to know the difference between then and now? Thad asked, his voice carrying across the silent market. Back then I fought people who knew what they were getting into, who stepped into the ring by choice and understood the risks. You three picked on an elderly woman selling pasta, thinking there'd be no consequences. Blake was struggling to get his breath back, still clutching his side where the liver shot had landed. Tyler remained slumped against the post, blood dripping from his nose onto his shirt. I could have hit you harder, Thad continued, standing up and looking around at the crowd of vendors and customers who'd witnessed the confrontation. I could have broken bones, done damage that would affect you for the rest of your lives. But I chose not to, because beating up bullies doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you another kind of bully. The moral weight of his words settled over the market like morning mist. Here was a man who'd been pushed beyond his limit, who'd defended himself and someone he cared about with devastating effectiveness, but who'd chosen restraint when brutality would have been easier. This is how it works from now on, Thad announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the market. You three find somewhere else to spend your Saturday mornings. You leave Angela alone, you leave all the vendors alone, and you think real hard about whether picking on people who can't defend themselves makes you feel like the big, strong men you pretend to be. Cody struggled to his feet, swaying slightly and clutching his ribs where the uppercut had landed. This ain't over, old man, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Thad replied with absolute certainty. It's completely over. The three men limped away, supporting each other and avoiding eye contact with the dozens of people who'd witnessed their humiliation. As they disappeared into the parking lot, conversation gradually resumed. But it was different now, charged with excitement and disbelief. Angela rushed over from her stall, stepping carefully around the scattered pasta packages and sauce stains. Thad, I can't believe... where did you learn to fight like that? Long time ago, he said simply, already kneeling to help her clean up the mess. Different life, different person, but she grabbed his hands, stopping him from picking up the damaged containers. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for standing up for me. I know that's not who you are anymore. Maybe it's exactly who I am, Thad replied, meeting her eyes. Maybe I've just been hiding from it for too long. And Dean, over the following weeks, everything changed at Riverside Market. Word spread through the vendor community about the quiet vegetable seller who'd taken down 3 tough guys without breaking a sweat. Vendors who'd previously kept to themselves began stopping by Thad's stall for conversation. Customers who'd been buying from him for years suddenly seemed to see him differently, asking about his boxing career and treating him with a respect that went beyond mere politeness. The market management, which had been struggling to address the harassment issues that several vendors had reported, suddenly found their problems solved without any official intervention. Other potential troublemakers took one look at the story circulating about Iron Thad Brennan and decided that Riverside Market might not be the easy target they'd thought it was. Patrick Donovan, who sold handmade furniture from the stall next to Thad's, started asking for advice about dealing with difficult customers. "Been doing this for 10 years, Patrick said one quiet Sunday morning. "Never seen anybody command respect the way you do now. It's like people finally see you for who you really are." "Who I really am is complicated," Thad replied, arranging a display of late summer squash. "But I'm learning that sometimes you have to remind people that quiet doesn't mean weak." The real change, though, came in his relationship with Angela. The friendship that had existed in stolen glances and brief conversations began to deepen into something more substantial. They started timing their setup and breakdown so they could walk to their cars together, sharing stories about their deceased spouses and their children who lived in distant cities, and their dreams of what retirement might look like if they could make it work financially. "Can I ask you something?" Angela said one evening as they loaded their unsold inventory into their respective vehicles. "Of course," Thad replied. "That day when you fought those men, were you afraid you might hurt them seriously?" Thad considered the question while folding his table and sliding it into the back of his pickup truck. "I was afraid I might enjoy it too much," he said finally. "Boxing was everything to me for a lot of years. The adrenaline, the competition, the feeling of being completely in control of a situation. When Margaret got sick, I realized that part of me was dangerous in ways I didn't want to admit. But you protected me," Angela said. "You did what was right." "I did what was necessary," Thad corrected. "But I also made sure not to cross the line between justice and revenge. That's the difference between being strong and being cruel." 6 weeks later, Angela invited him to dinner at her house, a small bungalow near the river where she'd lived with Vincent for 37 years before cancer took him. She cooked pasta with the same marinara sauce that had been destroyed during the confrontation, and they sat on her back porch watching barges navigate the Detroit River while talking about everything and nothing. "I've been thinking," Angela said as they shared a bottle of wine that Vincent had been saving for a special occasion, "about what you said that day, about quiet not meaning weak." "What about it?" Thad asked. "I spent 5 years after Vincent died trying to be invisible, trying not to bother anyone or take up too much space. Watching you stand up to those bullies reminded me that I'm allowed to exist fully, to take up exactly as much space as I need." Thad smiled, reaching across the small table to take her hand. "We're both too old to waste time being invisible." "Are we too old for other things?" Angela asked, her voice soft but direct in the way that came with having lived through enough to know what mattered. "I hope not," Thad replied, squeezing her fingers gently. 4 months later, Thad and Angela had become the unofficial guardians of Riverside Market, the couple that newer vendors sought out for advice and that troublemakers learned to avoid. They'd combined their stalls, selling vegetables and pasta from adjacent spaces that had effectively become one operation. Thad still looked like a 72-year-old retiree with silver hair and careful movements. But now he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd remembered that strength wasn't about age or size. It was about being willing to stand up for what mattered when the moment demanded it. One Saturday morning, while setting up their combined display, Angela pointed across the market toward the entrance. "Look," she said quietly. Cody Patterson was there with a woman and 2 small children, apparently shopping for produce like any normal family. When he saw Thad watching him, he nodded respectfully, not in friendship but in acknowledgement of a lesson learned the hard way. The swagger was gone, replaced by the careful humility of someone who discovered that the world contained people much stronger than him. Thad nodded back, then returned to arranging vegetables. He felt no satisfaction in the encounter, no need for vindication or further demonstration. He'd done what was necessary to protect someone who mattered to him and had chosen mercy when vengeance would have been easier. Later that morning, during a brief lull between customers, Angela leaned across their shared table and kissed his cheek. "What was that for?" Thad asked, though he was smiling. "For being brave when it mattered," she said. "For showing me that we're never too old to fight for what's right." As the morning crowd began to thin and the August sun climbed higher over Detroit, Thaddeus Brennan reflected on the strange turns that life could take. He was still a retiree selling vegetables at a farmer's market, still dealing with aching joints and the general indignities of growing older in a youth-obsessed culture. But he was no longer invisible, no longer someone that bullies could target without consequences. The lesson wasn't that violence solved problems, but that sometimes good people had to be willing to fight in order to remain good. Sometimes the choice wasn't between peace and conflict, but between justice and cowardice. And sometimes the person everyone underestimated was exactly the person who could change everything when circumstances demanded it. Iron Thad Brennan had found his balance between the fighter he'd once been and the peaceful man he'd chosen to become. Some things were worth defending, and some people deserved protection, even if the protecting required remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again in his golden years.